Welcome to the How It Works webinar series. We're glad to have you today. I'm David Velasco and I will be your host for this Power webinar. Today, JGS is glad to welcome you for some education and a little piece of Q&A afterwards. Everybody today wants to take control of its own policy, and this is what JGS is endeavoring to do. We also want to help you fix your insurance problems, and we will be pulling the curtain on how the insurance industry functions. So welcome to this first webinar of a series. Reopening, it's on everyone's mind, and not just here in the US, it's worldwide. But how is it going to impact our common interest communities here at home? How should you make a decision as far as opening or keeping your amenities closed for this season? Well, this is what we're going to discuss today in this webinar entitled Reopening, When, How, and Why. Let's start the first part of the program with Ross Rutman, Assistant Vice President of Community Association Insurance here at JGS. He will discuss reopening, the when.
Thank you, David. As David said, my name is Ross Rutman with JGS Insurance. I've been with the community association industry for about 15 years now. The first 10 years, I started on the property management side of things. So I'm the only broker out there who's actually sat in your seat, property managers. I feel your pain. Most of you have heard, at this point, there are various exclusions that we kind of brought to the surface throughout COVID and the pandemic. So I'm not going to bore you too much with that this go around. The question is when. And David, the answer is right here, right now. The weather is changing. Everybody's asking if they can reopen, not just here locally, but like you said, all over, worldwide. And more importantly, they're asking about the pools. Last year was a no-brainer. It was easy to keep things closed. We were in a new unknown world, and it made sense. Things were already closed, and we just followed our executive orders and followed through with it. But as time's going on, now vaccines are being rolled out. Our risk tolerance is changing, which Steve will get into a little later. And, hey, what are we doing? Managers and boards have a lot to handle already. Every day is a struggle. I've been there. Your full-time babysitters, your full-time psychiatrists, that's already 2 full-time jobs. Then you got your inspections, your violations, your work orders, phone calls, sometimes in the middle of the night for no reason. You're chasing homeowners and vendors all day, constantly educating yourself, like right now. Some of you might have started your plans already, and some of you might start tomorrow after hearing from us. But if your association chooses to reopen, you have to have a plan in place. If you really don't know where people are at right now, you could kind of survey, ask, see what's going on. Just because you can reopen doesn't mean that you have to. You've heard that a few times, I'm sure. But you need a plan, whether it's for this summer or even if it's for next, if that's what you decide. Getting the pools open, before the pandemic, they had their own hurdles, and now they're throwing new ones at us all the time. And we're trying to sit on standby to figure out what's next, or we're waiting on our new executive orders and the changing CDC guidelines. But when you're considering when, the time is now. And I want you to break it down into these 3 bullet points, really. Number 1, when you know what your homeowners want, you all represent many different properties with different amenity spaces and different demographics within it. But, take a temperature, and I don't mean, with a thermometer to check their fever like everything else right now, but see what they want to do. Back to, surveying them if you don't know. If you do know, here we are a year later. We've probably already heard a lot of the opinions, and we have a good idea of what the people want. And it's normalcy. We want to open up and get as close to normal as possible. And if you have no interest, right now, you averted the issue. But again, that's just right now. Before you know it, and we're already seeing it every day, we're getting calls. There's tons of interest out there on what people are considering and how to move forward. So number 2, your budget. After you have an idea of knowing what's going on, you want to make sure your budget is COVID ready. Are you over budget? Do you have adequate funds to defend the lawsuits that might not be covered by your insurance? Did you blow your budget with snow? I know a lot of areas did. Most budgets didn't include the extra janitorial costs, your soaps, your sanitizers, tracking softwares for booking time at the pool. and now the pool ambassadors. Maybe you did price everything out and you think you're financially prepared. But either way, our budgets are evolving and we need to evolve with them. And now that you know what's going on, you've looked at your budget, you have to develop your plan. Number 3, develop a plan. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. You know, if you have the required manpower out there, you know, the pool ambassadors, they're only working for 8-hour shifts and most of your pools are open longer than that. So you want to make sure your vendors are available for you. Just wake up, snap your finger and say we're reopening today. Important to have your staffing there. If your vendors can't support your plan, how could you even have one? I was talking to one of my clients yesterday, David, and they actually were asking about their gym. And it's a very small space. You could probably only have a handful of people in there on a normal day. And they have no windows, no ventilation, nothing. But they're actually thinking about relocating their equipment to another area of the clubhouse, pricing out new window options in that room as well, so that they can make their people a little more comfortable. You know, so there are options out there, whether we're talking gyms or we're talking pools. We can have a plan. It's vital you guys have all your proper protocols in place. You know, make sure you're chatting with your association attorney and your brokers, just to make sure we're following all of the orders and the guidelines that have been put out there. It sounds impossible, but we all want you to know it's not. You know, we can make this plan work together. Make sure you're working with professionals that specialize in community associations. We're all here to help you with a smooth reopening. Back over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Ross. These are very good points. And each association will have to analyze them and make their own determinations. And if they decide that it's now time to reopen, how are you going to go about it? Well, Mr. John Katz, attorney of community associations at Hill Wallach and president of the CAI chapter Keystone, will now develop the second piece of this webinar, reopening how.
So thank you, David, and thanks to everybody from JGS for inviting me to today's presentation. So as David said, my name is John Katz. I'm an attorney at Hill Wallach. And even though I am attorney, I may not be your attorney. So just quick legal disclaimer. Even though we're going to be talking about legal issues, please don't take this as legal advice. If you do have a question about reopening or anything else, please speak to your association counsel. Or if you don't have association counsel, please feel free to contact me. So as David said, my topic for today is how. So if you have decided to reopen, or if you're considering reopening all or some of your amenities, how can we get that done? The first thing that we're going to need to do, and I understand that there's people from all around the country on this call, so I'm not going to be really state specific, but the first thing you're going to do is we need to require compliance. So let's start with the premise that associations and boards have a general duty and an obligation to protect its residents from dangerous conditions. Now, normally when we think about dangerous conditions, we think of trip hazards or potholes, but dangerous conditions can also be a pandemic like COVID-19. So when you're thinking about reopening, boards need to consider this duty, as well as the general duty to protect the association's financial well-being. So we're going to talk about insurance, I'm sure, after all, this is a JGS presentation. But as you know, most associations do not have insurance for COVID-related cases. So boards need to think about making sure they're taking affirmative actions to protect the association from being sued. And if that means keeping the clubhouse or the pool closed, that's what they should do. That being said, if you do want to reconsider opening, you must require strict compliance with all federal, state, and local regulations in whatever state you're in. So what are those requirements? So like I said, it's going to vary from state to state. In New Jersey, where I am, the governor just eased restrictions a little bit. So indoor gatherings moved from 10 to 25, and outdoor gatherings moved from 25 to 50. Other states are seeing similar lessening on restrictions as well. And the thing you should know, obviously, is it's a lot easier to have an opening outdoor amenities than it is opening indoor amenities. So the second issue I want to talk about is waivers. So everybody throws that around, waiver this, waiver that. What is a waiver? Well, a liability waiver is a legal document where a person who signs the waiver is intentionally relinquishing a right, a claim, or a privilege. And in this case, it would be the right to sue the association if they're alleging that they got COVID for being on the association's property using the amenities. The person who's signing that waiver is acknowledging and assuming the risk involved with participation in the activity, like using a pool or a gym. And just to give you an example, my favorite is always when I take my kids to those bounce places and they make you sign a waiver before your kids go and get all sweaty on the bounce plays. So I do want to talk about one case in particular involving waivers. We haven't really seen a ton of COVID-related cases across the nation, but there was a case in Virginia where a Virginia pool, an association in Virginia decided to open up their pool, and they required everyone who wanted to use the pool, all the residents, to sign what's called an assumption of risk form. They don't allow waivers, liability waivers in Virginia, but they do allow assumption of risk forms. And what the court found in that case was that the association did have the right to require that assumption of risk form to be signed before it would allow the resident to use the association pool. One more thing to think about in terms of waivers, though, you have to understand that waivers are not absolute, and they have not been tested either here in New Jersey or in other states across the country related to COVID, as far as we know. The other thing is waivers are not going to cover the association if there's an allegation that the association was grossly negligent or intentionally did not comply with those requirements we talked about. That's why we're going to require strict compliance. So even if the associations do your waivers, we have the issue regarding insurance, like I mentioned before. And namely that, so again, if you're using a waiver, somebody signs a waiver and they still do sue, because there's not going to be any insurance, the association still is going to be on the hook for defense costs. And again, I'm sure that's something that we'll get into a little bit later in the program. So I do want to talk one quickly about immunity legislation. In a number of states across the country, the state legislators have signed into law immunity legislation, which would protect associations or other businesses from being sued for COVID. So as of today, there are 14 states that have passed that legislation. The states that I'm involved in, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, have not. There are pending bills in both states. However, we don't really have a great feeling as to how that's going to go. Again, and as of now, legislation has not been passed in those states. If you are in another state and not New Jersey or Pennsylvania, I'll just throw in a plug for CAI National. They have a great tool on their website. You go to their advocacy page and you click on the COVID-19 and you can see if your state has passed some type of immunity legislation. The last thing I wanted to mention today, and then again, we're always going to take questions at the end, is require common sense. Like Ross said, just because you can open your amenities doesn't mean you have to. It really is a good idea to take the temperature of your community because there are going to be those risks that are still there. There are going to be those extensive costs that could be, especially if you're going to open the pool and you may need a pool ambassador or additional cleaning. So the board really needs to use common sense before they make that decision whether or not to reopen. Back to you, David.
Well, thank you very much, John. We appreciate you helping us to grasp the complexity of making that decision as far as reopening or not, and how it should be planned. Now, every one of us, I think we can agree on one thing. We all want to go back to some sense of normalcy. We all want to go back to things as they were before. And some associations will determine that their appetite for reopening is greater than the risk at hand. So they will decide to put that plan together. They feel like they're ready. They have the budget. They checked all the check boxes and they're ready to go. But still, question is, why should they reopen? Because they may have to answer that question to somebody at one point. So let's listen to the last piece of this presentation with our closer, Steve Roderick, Assistant Vice President of Community Association here also at JGS. He will present reopening. Why?
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Steve Roderick, and today I'd like to share with you some thoughts about why we should reopen, or possibly why we should not. Personally, I'd like to see the world go back to the way it was about 13 months ago, and many of you probably agree. Now, so far, we have not seen any cases where insurance carrier has supported a COVID-related claim. Therefore, we collectively must go forward, assuming there is no coverage for COVID-related claims. Now, that being said, why are these questions regarding amenities so important? Why is this such an issue? Why are we talking about this constantly? Simply put, because we are a community. We choose to live here because we enjoy the facilities and the amenities that we are paying for to use and to maintain. And then we also pay a lot of money to periodically upgrade. We enjoy the clubhouse, the tennis court, the pool, the playgrounds, etc. We enjoy all of these amenities, and each part of the association makes us who we are. They help make up the community as a whole. So without them, we are literally less of a community than we were before. Is it just a pool? Maybe. Is it just a gym? Well, for some people, but it also may be one of the reasons I or you or your neighbor choose to live here rather than a community that doesn't have one of these. So why is it the board's ultimate decision? As you have heard along the way many, many times, just because you can reopen doesn't mean that you have to, or does it? So as volunteer representatives of the community, you are in the best position to make the most educated decisions and to act in the best interest of the community. Keeping in close and constant communication with management is the key to make the right decision for your community. I'll say that again. Close and constant communication. Realistically, you are probably doing that already, or you should be anyway. Now, as managers, you are the liaison between the outside vendors and the board. That can include pool companies, sanitation companies, restoration companies, security companies, and so on. All of these support businesses that keep our community functioning and a nice place to live. Management is the corridor to the various vendors and the contractors needed to support the decisions you may have to face to open or not to reopen. So why are we even considering this? Well, the topic is the same. Attitudes are very, very different. Some things have definitely changed over the past year regarding this discussion, and there are different reasons for that. We have more data, for one. Increased knowledge of the disease and the treatments. We have release of vaccines. And we also have a population, a higher population that has the antibodies. People have recovered from COVID. More specifically, our collective risk tolerance is much higher than it was last spring. We've got a pretty good bead on what's happening and how to deal, and there are far less unknowns. More information plus more education equals higher risk tolerance. So there's also an implied sentiment that by now we've figured it out, and that we, the board and the management, should have a plan together for reopening amenities. Last year, we didn't know what to do. This year, we have a much better idea. And the community as a whole has a certain expectation of accountability for those who are making the important decisions, and that's you guys. So now a very interesting question. In the last big why question, why is it important to consider the ramification of remaining closed? To put it another way, what happens if we decide not to reopen? Can we even remain closed if we want to? Will the unit owners and the residents storm the clubhouse or the offices with torches and pitchforks? Well, they might. Do they have a valid reason to? Well, they just might. So, big suggestion, a friendly suggestion is document, document, document. Plan like you are building your defense. We, you, as a board member or manager, unfortunately can't please everybody. Some will want to open and some will not want to incur the potential risk and or costs involved. It's critical to keep accurate records of attorney correspondence and local and state ordinances. Also, be prepared to share estimates from your service provider. Simply saying it's too expensive isn't going to cut it. You may find yourselves in a position where residents want to know just how much things actually cost. Keep in mind that third-party service providers have the same or similar exclusions on their policies. Trying to transfer risk to them is not always a viable plan. Next, plan to be flexible. The situation may become more fluid, and you should have a contingency plan. What thresholds of contamination in your particular region triggers what action from the board regarding the decision to reopen or close the amenities? Meaning, should things get better, do we reopen if we haven't yet opened? Or conversely, if things get worse again, when do we close back up? God forbid. Nobody wants that, and it may be a lot harder to close back up after we've already opened. I'm sure you can imagine how difficult that scenario might be and the resistance that will come with it, but it could happen. Above all, perhaps the most important takeaway from all this is transparency, and that's how we're all going to succeed in managing the expectations of the community and the residents. Make all decisions public and known. Be sure to make frequent announcements in the newspapers, post up on your bulletin boards. However you guys in your community handles the news, do more of that. Hopefully the numbers will improve and we can begin to regain some of the normalcy we all want so desperately. So I hope everyone watching today continues to stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you. David, back to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you, Ross. And also thank you, John, our guest from Hill Wallach today, for answering those questions, bring up these important points that every one of us need to keep in mind for this season. We also want to thank all the attendees for this Power webinar. We promised we were going to keep it short, and we're just at the 22-minute mark. So before you leave, we want to remind you that before you make a final decision, or before you make that decision public, please check your local laws and ordinances, make a plan, contact your counsel and your insurance broker before you make those final decisions and make them public. Thank you very much again for attending. We will now move on to the Q&A section of this presentation. Keeping HIPAA in mind, how can we incorporate the question, are you vaccinated, into allowing residents to gather or use the amenities? Any taker? John, maybe? If you had to summarize in one word.
Right. So, vaccines are a really hot topic right now. Obviously, there's a huge problem in terms of, trying to get a vaccine. Not everybody who wants a vaccine is able to get it. So to answer the question, community associations generally are not governed by HIPAA. HIPAA, they don't fall under the covered entity definition of HIPAA. That being said, there are privacy issues that an association has to think about. So from my perspective, there's really two questions an association needs to think about when they are talking about considering requiring vaccines. The first question is, can we do it legally? I think the answer to that one is yes. And it's analogous to being an employer. The federal government has already come out and said employers can require employees to be vaccinated. It's the same type of issue. There are distinctions to that, though, however, for people who may have either a medical reason or a religious reason why they cannot have a vaccine. So employers and probably associations would need to make reasonable accommodations if they were to require vaccines. And a more important question, in my opinion, is should associations do it? And for the time being, I think the answer is no. I think there's too many issues, with people who want to get it and can't get it. There's the issue of children who certainly can't get it right now. And then how are we going to monitor it? What's the association going to require? I've already heard stories in other states about people forging those CDC cards. So it's really a difficult decision for the association. Again, in my opinion, and I urge you to speak to your association's attorney. In my opinion, it's not worth it for the association to do that.
Thank you very much, John. Here's another interesting question from Chris. If a board decides not to open amenities and is sued as a result, will the DNO provide for defense and coverage? And will they try to say that it is because it is related to COVID and decide not to cover anyway?
Well, it's an answer that nobody likes hearing at this point, but it depends. When it comes down to all of these claims, there's too many specifics to really give a general yes or no. Of course, people are going to file claims and they're going to point it to, these are insurance carriers. It's a business. If there's an exclusion, there's an exclusion and they're going to find it. But that's where your broker comes to play. Let them work every angle of the claim. They know their policies. This way they can kind of, see what's going to go through and what's not. Because it's not all COVID related. If these cases, and I don't want to take away from, what John might be able to add, but if these cases actually do go to court and the judge is like, well, why'd you stay closed? Your reason probably isn't COVID anymore. That's just like one of the bullet points. Money was a topic. Did you prepare this year? There's all these various rules being thrown into the mix. So I think that's where, we're going to see a lot of hairy claims along the way. But to Steve's point, we haven't seen them yet.
As a follow-up question, we had a quote from Sherry here. Sherry is mentioning for her, it's frustrating to listen to all the planning, communication, budgeting issues that we need to put in place. Yet the only thing that is keeping her particular association or associations from opening is the failure to provide liability insurance. Do we have any comment on that?
The failure to provide liability insurance for COVID, the exclusions for viruses have been around since 2002, since SARS-ish. So it's not dependent. Opening isn't dependent on having liability insurance. What liability insurance is there for is to cover defense in case of a lawsuit against. So the important thing to do is to build the defense on your own. Just go forward knowing that you may be facing a lawsuit. Now, if you do everything that you can ahead of time in preventative measures, if you're following the CDC guidelines, if you're doing your due diligence before opening, well, then you don't have much of a risk of a lawsuit then. So it shouldn't be the lack or an exclusion of liability insurance keeping one from opening rather than just proper preparation.
Yeah, a lot of the questions have been coming our way, like if there is no coverage, what does this mean for a board member, like, being sued personally? And the way most of our governing documents are written, and again, this is something to review with your broker and your attorney, but the association still is required to defend those board members in the event of a suit, even if there is no coverage. So that's where, there's major risk. Where there is no coverage, you become that coverage, the association's pocket. So even though like a homeowner might decide to sue the association, they're technically suing themselves, just like a general slip and fall along the way before our pandemics.
Thank you very much for the clarification to the both of you. Now, there was an interesting point here, as I was kind of touched a little bit by John. Can a HOA limit pool or clubhouse limit the clubhouse use to people per persons that have received their vaccination?
I think the answer is that legally, I think they can, but the more important question in my mind is whether they should. Right now, I think the answer to that, again, in my opinion, is no. Could that change in 3 or 6 months? Yeah, it could change. So, but for right now, my recommendation would be not to do that.
Very good. Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions that were similar. I'm going to combine them. So let's say you have an association that opened up last year. They had their residents sign a waiver. Do they have to make them sign it again or a newer waiver this season? What's your take on this?
So waivers are generally good unless they're revoked. Again, if you have a different form of waiver, or if the waiver the first season said it was only for that specific pool season, I would say, yeah, get the person to sign a new waiver. But you're not going to need to sign the person to sign a new waiver each time they go to the pool.
Another question here, interesting. What about housing discrimination issues with requiring vaccine? Does this cause a class issue with owners?
So in order to have discrimination, you have to have a protected class. Arguably, familial status could be a protected class. But again, like I mentioned before, there are going to be some people who either medically or for other reasons can't get a vaccine. So there is a risk that there will be some type of lawsuit, whether it's discrimination or otherwise, if you're trying to ban people just who have vaccinated, use the clubhouse or use the pool.
An interesting question about lifeguard being required to provide vaccination proof or for the ambassadors. Is that something that we should consider within our planning? Or can we even ask the company, the service provider, to give proof of vaccination?
It's another legal question. So yeah, again, that's really, that's something that you can negotiate with your pool contractor or vendor. Again, they may just tell you whether or not their employees are vaccinated. Like I said before, there's been federal regulations that have come out saying that employers can require vaccinations for their employees. I assume that if you ask your pool contractor, they will probably tell you that yes or no.
John, is that something you think that in due time managers are going to put into their RFPs?
I think it's a good question. I think, again, like I said, my answer may change in 3 months or 6 months from now. But I really don't know. It's something that we could see going forward.
What is the statute of limitation actually for a lawsuit that would be related to a COVID claim?
So because a COVID claim is basically a bodily injury or a personal injury claim, in New Jersey, it's 2 years. I practice primarily in New Jersey, so I can't really answer that for other states.
All right, here's something from Sherry. You mentioned that you have excluded coverage for pandemic/virus previously, but travel insurance companies historically had the same exclusions, but now some have decided to cover vaccine-related expense. Are you considering making a similar change to meet today's challenges? That's actually a question for the carriers.
Yeah. That would be more of a question specific to the insurance carriers. We as brokers, we shop for the association on behalf of the association for the boards for the insurance. So we try to find the best coverage for the best premium dollar and or to fit the community. So it's going to be up to the carriers collectively. I don't see that happening. In fact, if anything, it's quite the opposite. The they're actually getting a little bit firmer, if you will. They're actually cleaning up some verbiage and taking any question or any kind of notion or any leeway out of it. In fact, we're actually seeing where the excess coverage carriers or the umbrella carriers are putting their own verbiages in case the underlying policy verbiage is lacking. So as far as the the GL and the property and the D&O carriers are concerned, for community associations, it seems to be moving in the other direction. But again, that's carrier specific, so I can't speak for all of them.
Yeah, it's kind of like the pools last year, right? Like everybody was like, hey, well, we're not using our pool. Do we get a refund on that? Well, there's still a pool there. There's still a risk on the insurance side, especially most of us got those pools up and running, so they would still properly work for the upcoming season. So they're looking at, like, there's still a property there. There's still a place that could potentially have liability for someone to drown, so insurance kind of stays the same. And to go piggyback off of your point, Steve, and we've all been out there saying it for a while now, but there's so much going on in the world that has been costly in the insurance world. And that's what's been driving up your premiums. Some of you might not even have a loss on your record, but your premiums are going up. And we're going to have another session on that in the next few weeks.
Exactly. And we mentioned the goal of these sessions were all to pull the curtain on the inner workings of the insurance industry, and we will be addressing rising premiums in future sessions. Now, something related to high-rise living, it might be interesting, maybe will be our last question. If you have a high-rise with with restrictions on how many people can be in the elevator car, as restrictions are loosening from a state and local level, how can the association, or should the association, maintain restriction as precautionary? What is your recommendation on that, Steve, Ross, John?
So following our executive orders, that's our bare minimum. We want to make sure we're following the guidelines put out by the CDC and from our governor. If we choose to do a little extra, that's okay, but we can't do less.
And if we decide to do extra, you mentioned to have a plan in your part, Ross, and that's really following up in line with that. Steve, you mentioned make sure that you have your quotes and everything ready to share. And John, you mentioned clearly have your local council, your association council ready to be called. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact us. Reply to the emails that you will receive as a follow-up. So thank you very much again for joining us, and we will see you around.